this is kind of relevant to the class. I'll just segue into the class with this. Software updating sucks. It's frustrating. So the big one, whenever you update software, I'll start in the context of developers because I hate seeing this in the world. If you're on a team that wants to do this, don't. Changing your public-facing API of any code that you write. If you have a code, maybe it's a library that other people or a framework that other people are using, ever change the API. You can update it, you can add things. Don't remove things for the sake of everything. It's frustrating. I was dealing with this all this morning too, so it was already fresh. But and one of the big things I'm dealing with is Scala just came out with Scala 3 instead of Scala 2. They're doing the same thing Python did, where Scala 3 is not backward compatible with Scala 2. They changed all the APIs, they changed the way you use Scala. And I'm faced with this decision of, do I update 1.16 to Scala 3 to get the 2 features that we're never going to use in 1.16, and I got to go through and update all my examples, all my slides, all my graders, all my homeworks. Do I do all of that? I don't want to. I'll sooner change the language of the course. I'm thinking of starting the conversation and trying to switch it to Java, because that's just so friggin' frustrating that a group of professional developers out there in the world releasing software that millions of people use are just going to be like, yeah, we're changing everything. I thought everybody learned from Python's mistake. We still have Python 2 versus Python 3 issues, and Scala just did the same thing. And Scala is nowhere near as popular as Python. That very well could be the end of Scala. I was one of the big proponents of Scala, and it's got me wanting to switch off of it. Like, I don't know, I'll bring it up with the department, see what everybody else thinks. So today is demo day. We're going to talk about databases with Docker Compose. These are the 2 big things that we talked about Wednesday. There's no strictly new concepts today. I'm just going to show you examples of what we learned on Wednesday. Today's Wednesday. What we learned on Monday. So this is one of them lectures where I strongly encourage you to ask questions during this. Anything that you're struggling with Docker Compose or databases. Anything that doesn't make sense. I assume a lot of you haven't played with this yet, but if you have and ran into trouble, definitely let me know. If you haven't and things just aren't making sense, please let me know. This lecture, every lecture is for all of you to learn, but these lectures more so because I already covered the concepts behind this material, and now I'm just showing you how to actually apply it in your code. It's something I've added to this course because the first time I taught it, everyone's like, your slides make sense, but when I go to code it, I have no freaking clue what to do. So I added more of these example lectures. So please, I don't know where you're stumbling when you go to implement things, so please ask me questions, let me know, and I can show you. I can demo things. I'll have the lecture open as always, the lecture channel on Discord. I think that's old. What day is today? 20th? Yeah, that's from Monday. And let's talk about some things. All right. So here's a Docker Compose file. This is very similar to what we saw in the slides on Monday. I'm going to use, and I'll refresh the content that we talked about, at least briefly. So with Docker Compose, what we want to do is run multiple Docker containers to form one single app. So here I have 2 services that I want to start. One I'm naming Mongo, and one I'm naming app. These are names that I choose. I can name these anything I want. There's nothing special about the name Mongo right here. But whenever you want to refer to that container, you do have to match that name. So whatever you name that container, make sure you name it the same, refer to it with the same name that you named it here. With this Mongo container, I'm just saying take the image Mongo 4.2.5. I'm going to specify my version so I don't have that problem that I just complained about, where the latest version isn't backward compatible. They have a new major release and they break everything. By the way, if the first number changes in a release, that is meant to signify, I don't know if every dev team follows this, but it's meant to signify that you have non-reverse compatible changes. You have a completely different version of the software that's not going to be compatible with older versions. If you have minor release changes, those are meant to be backward compatible. So any version of Mongo that starts with 4 should be compatible with each other within reason. 4.8, for example, of some software might have new features that weren't included in 4.2, but your 4.2 code will not break if you run it on 4.8. But if you run 4.8 code on 5.0, it might not work. So just a heads up on that. One thing we do in Docker is specify the versions of everything. That way we're not going to run into those problems, hopefully, at least. Though this morning one of my examples broke because that problem did occur in a way that I can't easily fix, can't quickly fix. So I'm saying pull this image, and I think it's in my next example. I'll pull it up. That's going to be the same as this. It's going to be a Docker file that just says from Mongo, and then I think it technically exposes, it exposes this implicitly, but it does expose 27017 to make sure that we can access that port. Since I don't need a whole Docker file, I'm just going to say pull this image, and I'm just using that raw image. I don't need to make any changes to it, so I'm just going to say use this image, download it off the internet, and that should work for my purposes. Then I'm going to build my app, and I'm going to specify the same information that we specified when we run a container. When we build and run, I suppose. When we build a container, we always have that trailing dot, which says use this Docker file. So use the Docker file, a file named Docker file that's in this directory, and I'm going to specify the current directory. A dot in Unix and Linux specifies the current directory that you're currently in. So I have my Docker compose file in the same directory as my Docker file. So I'm just going to say work in this directory. I'm going to go into this directory, run Docker compose, and I'm going to say you can find a file named Docker file in this same directory. So that's going to build using this Docker file. Then I'm going to map a local port to a port inside the container. For your homeworks, this will be mapping 8080 to 8000 or whatever if you want to change your internal port number. By the time you're using Docker Compose, I don't care what your internal port number is, because we're going to access 8080. So for your homework, this would have to be 8080. Might as well change it. Not going to hurt anything. But your internal port number inside your container where your app runs, I don't care what that is anymore because the TAs and myself don't have to know. We don't have to map to anything. It'll be in your Docker Compose file. Your Docker Compose file will expose local port 8080 and map that to whatever your app is running. But that's the same as -p and then mapping the ports when you run a container. And we have this extra thing that we haven't seen before, setting an environment variable named wait hosts with the value Mongo 27017. So this, combined with my Docker file, is going to install this command right here, this wait command, from GitHub. And we can copy this URL and see the repo. I'm just pulling one of the releases from this repo by UFO Scout, who made this excellent command and shared it with the world. It's going to allow us to wait for a specific port of a specific host to be available to be accepting TCP connections before we run the rest of our commands. So what that does, and you have to change the mods to make sure it's executable. You have to make sure that's executable. I'm downloading the file, downloading the command, setting the permissions to make sure that it's executable, and then I'm running that command, and then and 2 ampersands. This is going to run both of these commands. So it's going to run the wait command. Once the wait command exits, once that program exits, then it's going to run my app. The wait command is going to read this wait host's environment variable. It's going to look for that environment variable. If you run that without setting the environment variable, it's not going to do anything. It's going to look for this environment variable and then wait for this host to be listening to TCP connections on this port. Once it is listening for TCP connections on that port, then it's going to exit. It's going to say you're good, and then I'm going to move on to the next command, which is running my app. This is a way of waiting for the database to be running before trying to start my app. My app, the very first thing it's going to do, well, one of the first things it's going to do is connect to the database. If there's no database running, it's going to crash. It's going to say couldn't connect to the database and crash. So I want to make sure the database is running first. This is one solution. If you want to use a different solution, be my guest. As long as it works, please make sure it works before you submit and go, I didn't know. You know because I'm telling you right here. And I told you on Monday. This solution works. It's effective. It's, I would say a little bit crude, but I actually think it's kind of elegant. It's robust. It's very robust. The wait command is just going to keep pinging that port, that host and port, until it's accepting TCP connections, until it can get through the three-way handshake. And then once it does, it's going to exit. It's not a whole lot that can go wrong when you're doing it like that. A lot of other solutions, there are different ways to do this. None that I've seen as effective and robust as this one. So kudos to UFO Scout. Never met the person. I don't know who they are, but they really built this really effective wait command, which I really enjoy. Yeah.
Does Docker not have like a built-in wait command?
Docker does have a built-in wait command. It does not wait for TCP connections. So Docker's built-in wait command is going to wait until the container is running. So when the database container is running, it's going to say, okay, we're done waiting, run the app. Well, when the database container is running, it still has a very lengthy startup script to actually be ready to be listening for TCP connections, to be ready for commands. So what Docker's going to do is say, okay, your container's built, it's doing its thing, I called its command, it's doing its thing, start your app. It's going to run your container, and now you have a race condition. If your app is very slow to start, then maybe that database will be ready by the time you connect to it. But you have a race condition. In most cases, you're probably connecting to your database right away. It's probably like right after your import statements, you're going to connect to that database. That's running like almost immediately. And that database is still going through its startup script. As far as I know, maybe it's in a recent release. Maybe they added this, but I don't think so. I think I read somewhere that they don't intend to add it. But Docker Compose doesn't have a feature where it can wait for a container to be accepting TCP connections, which is an effective way to make sure that it went through its whole startup script. So if you do, I forget what it is, but there are some commands you can add here. Wait for the container Mongo to build. You can try it. I'm warning you right now, it's not going to work. And it's not an excuse if you get a poor score. If you're like, well, my database didn't work. I did what the internet told me to do. I'm telling you right now, it's not going to work. The only way that'll work is if you're connecting to the database on each request, then maybe, depending on how you have your app built. But this is robust. You don't even have to think about waiting for the database in your code itself. It's just going to be ready. So wait is going to wait for whatever's in here. We're going to use the host name, which remember, these names that we gave the services are the host names. So if I change this to Mongo123, I'm going to change this to Mongo123. Those have to match because that's saying this host, wait for this host to be ready to accept connections on that port, the default port for MongoDB 27017. I'm going to change these so I don't have to change all my code. And then that's going to make sure that we have a database to connect to when we start our app. And part of the problem here, I shouldn't say problem, this is a nice feature, is that Docker Compose is going to build these containers effectively concurrently. It's going to start them both up. So we need a way to say, wait for Mongo, because we don't have a way to say, just build Mongo and then just build app. I mean, maybe we do, but Docker Compose up isn't going to do that. It's just going to fire them both up, which is nice. If we have like 20 containers we want to build, we just want to build them all. Fire all these up. Yep.
Our Docker file needs to be called Docker file with no extension. Does Docker Compose need to be Docker-Compose?
Yeah, this has to be Docker-compose.yml, all lowercase letters. That is standard. If it's not, you can specify the file name, but by default, this is what it's looking for. So if you just want to say like Docker compose up, then name your file this, and don't make it harder for yourself by having to specify the file name. Same with Dockerfile. We can name this something else. We can name this whatever we want, but then we would have to specify the Dockerfile name, which I believe the syntax is just give it the full thing. If we give this a directory, it looks for a Dockerfile. If we give it a full path, I believe it will use that file name. I was just naming Dockerfile, so I don't know 100%, but I'm pretty sure that's the syntax. But it is giving me a warning, so rollback changes. And when we want to run this, one really nice thing about Docker Compose up. And damn it, Docker Compose. I'm already using port 8080. About 3,000. So now Docker Compose up, and that's it. I just spun up a database, a database in a container, and my app in a separate container that are communicating with each other. Docker Compose up, that's it. So when we go to grade your homework, we're going to download your zip, extract it, Docker Compose up, and your app should be running. With just Docker, things were a little more complex. We had 2 commands. We had a bunch of options to specify. Now we're putting all those options in the Docker Compose file and just Docker Compose up. Easy. So when you go to deploy an app, you want to be live on the internet, you put your files on that server, Docker Compose up, and then routing if you want a domain name. There's some extra steps there. But Docker Compose up, and you're running on whatever hardware, whatever server you want. In most cases, it's that simple, and that's the solution that Docker is offering, is that on my laptop, on your laptop, on a production server, doesn't matter where, you have Docker and Docker Compose installed, Docker Compose up, your app's running. As long as it runs on your laptop, it should, in theory, run everywhere. Now, sometimes there are weird things that happen. In some cases, whenever they happen to me, it's usually my mistake. Well, I guess that's always the truth for developers, for development. But when you're handing in your homework, if you want to avoid mistakes like that, whatever you handed into Autolab, download that zip file, extract it, and run Docker Compose up. Make sure that runs. I strongly recommend testing that because after every deadline, especially with homework too, I get tons of emails. I shouldn't say tons, but like 5 to 10. I submitted and I realized my app doesn't work. And then after grades are released, there's another flood of emails. I got all 1s. What happened? I don't know. Just test your app. Like go take what you submitted to Autolab. You can download your zip file and go through the exact testing procedures that we go through. So especially when it's Docker Compose, if you can't download the zip, extract it, go to that directory and run Docker Compose up and have your app running and working on port 8080, you got some debugging to do still. And to be fair, I think most of those issues are students submitting at the last minute. Just start early. You've heard that plenty of times. If you haven't done that before, you're not going to do it. You're not going to start all of a sudden in a 300 level class, so I ain't going to dwell on that. But start early. So if we look at the logs, we're going to see Mongo's startup script. We can see it's a lengthy process. There's a lot going on. There's a lot to start up Mongo. We want to make sure this is working before we start to run our app. So, and we're going to see these kind of weird. It happened in that order. This might just be the order that they printed to the screen. It might not have happened in this order because it seems weird. But we can see our wait script checking to see if Mongo is available. It says it is available, which I don't really believe it in that order. Mongo goes through its startup script, starting the server. I got a deprecation warning, just like I was saying before class. So I'm using something that's about to be removed from that library because they just want to piss me off. Scala switching to Scala 3, and also akka, the actors that we used in 1.16, they updated that library as well when Scala changed to 2.13 around the same time. It's frustrating. Maybe it's just the Scala developers that completely ignore that. So maybe that's why I'm so frustrated. But you definitely see it elsewhere as well. Anyway, so let's go to port 3000. We should have this running. Port 3000. And then I have this really silly hack. I'm not too worried about security on this app. Oh, I don't have my... Let's get some data in here. But we can add songs. This is a songwriting app. You may or may not have seen this when you took 116. I phase it in and out from time to time. And then we can rate songs. I can't rate this one because I'm the uploader, so I should have some checks that say you already rated this song. And everyone can upload, submit, and rate songs. That's what this app is actually doing. So what I want to show, why I want some data in that database, first of all, let's stop this container and then run it in detach mode. We don't want to see the logs right now. I'm going to run this in detach mode, and I want to show you a little bit of just like kind of Docker tips and tricks for a second. So I uploaded some data to the database, but I don't really have a good way of accessing that data. I mean, I can through my app, but if I'm trying to debug something, that's probably not going to work. It's probably what I'm debugging. So what I can do is go to Docker PS. That's going to show me all of the running containers. Now I have two apps running. One of my other examples is running right now, the broken one that I was trying to debug. And I can see music rating app. Actually, no, it's a working one that's running. Music rating app and the Mongo container for the music rating app. So I can see both of these containers running to support my app. And say I want to go into one of these containers. And I want to actually see what's going on inside of Docker. There is a way to do that. I'm going to enter into the command shell, the command line of one of these containers. It's going to be very helpful with your assignments. I'm going to do docker exec-it, the ID of the container. And I had the font so big, things don't line up nice and clean right here. But if you have a reasonable size font, these will be line up cleaner, but container ID is the first one. Then I'm going to enter the bash shell. Now I'm in my container where my code is running. I can see if I check the present working directory, I'm going to be in /root, because in my Docker file, I always change the working directory and home directory to /root. So I know my directory is going to be /root, and I copied all of my code in there. So if I do an ls, I should see all of my code. This is all my app code, my Docker file, my Docker compose file, all my other stuff. Not that I need those in the container, but since I just copied all of my project files, everything's going to be in there. And you can look around, if you have any file I/O, if you have like for image uploads, you can see if your images are actually there. You can see if their sizes are the sizes that you expect, etc. And then exit to get out of there. So now I'm back on my machine. Docker PS. I want to get the ID for another container. This is what I want to show today. That was more of a side note. I'm going to go into my container running Docker. There's too many words. Container running, my Docker container running MongoDB. I want to go into that container. Here things are going to look a little different because I didn't set it up. The working directory is just the root directory. And I see all the, all the Linux stuff when I go in here. And it just has, I wonder if we could run top and see. We just have MongoDB running, my bash script, and then top, which I'm running right now. So the only thing that's actually running in this container is just the MongoDB daemon, which means I can go into Mongo, which is the thing I want to do. So if you type Mongo, you can enter into Mongo shell. So if you're following, we were in an IDE in the terminal on my local machine, entered into the terminal and the Docker container, and then entered into the CLI of MongoDB inside that container. So I'm several layers deep into my machine, into things that are running here. So inside this container, inside MongoDB, I can start using my MongoDB CLI. So I want to show databases is one thing I can do because I don't remember what I named my database. Some of these are created by Mongo itself, but music that was created by me. I want to use that database, show all the collections that I have, which I have 3 different collections, and say I want to get everything out of music ratings. I'm going to do db dot the collection name. I'm going to run the find command. I'm going to find everything, just give it an empty object, I guess. And then that'll give me data in this format, which I really don't like. So I like to slap a dot pretty on the end of this to format, to give me some pretty printing, to format that a little better. And I can see that song that I uploaded. I can see the YouTube ID, my rating, and everything that I want to know about that. I could also do the same thing with music logs. I think music logs is where I store who rated everything. So it's saying that I uploaded this song, and I gave it this rating. So then when I try to rate this song again, I'm going to pull up my logs and say, yo, you already rated this, this song. I'm going to pull up everything by YouTube ID equals this and API key equals this. And if I get any results, I'm going to say, you already rated this thing. Anyone have any questions on any of this? I really want questions because I don't know what you want to see. Because I'm just going to keep going like this, if not. Yes?
Is the process for checking out MySQL about the same for like going into like?
Yeah, I do have an example on that. That's the one that won't run, so I can't run it, but I can show you the code. There are some differences. I think I'll jump to that one next in this interest of time to make sure I get a MySQL example in there. And then in the actual code, I won't show much of the code, but I'm connecting to Mongo. Where am I actually doing things? Routes index. And then when I'm connected to my database, oh, I added it. I see what I did. When I'm connected to my database, I'm going to get a specific collection and then run my commands to be able to get everything. For what it's worth, I shuffle all the songs each time. If when I use this, we don't need to talk about that. It's a little UX thing. But when I do use this, students will always rate like the first 2 songs that they see. So I always shuffle the order to make sure we don't have 2 songs with 100 ratings and then everything else with 1 rating. But anyway, when we get a song, I'm going to read all of the information that the user sent. I'm going to escape any HTML. I'm going to check if they're allowed to use the API. I'm going to do some validation, etc. Which one was this? This is add song, wasn't it? Make sure that the song wasn't already added, and then if it wasn't, that's where I'm going to insert into this collection. I'm going to insert all of that data as a record, as a document into this collection, etc. I'm not going to go through all of them. I do want to show song not in database. This one that I was just mentioning. So if you're trying to rate a song, but there's a record that matches both your API key and that YouTube ID, and you already rated this song. I'm not going to let you rate it again. If you are using JavaScript, this starts to get to what we call callback hell. JavaScript is inherently concurrent. So if you don't have a callback function, or if you're not using promises, if you're not using one or the other, you're going to have big trouble using JavaScript. So just a heads up for those of you using Node, everything is going to be asynchronous. So when you call collections.find, this is going to fire off it's going to fire off this code and immediately go to the next line of your function and not wait for the database connection to resolve. So database connections can be slow. Talking to the database, you don't want to wait for that. JavaScript is built for efficiency and optimization in this sense, in the concurrent sense. So it's immediately going to the next line. So what you want to do is give this a callback or use promises. I'm using callbacks here, where I say, once that is done, call this function. This function will be called with the results of that database call. So before I make another database call, I need to make sure that this database call finished, and I can do the checks that I want to do. And then in this one, I'm going to have another, these are bad variable names. These, when I don't use the variables, I like to call them underscore. And then in this callback, then I'm going to do the next thing that I need to do. And then the innermost callback, that's where you should be actually communicating to the user. That's where I'm going to actually not send anything. Oh yeah, right here, res.end. Actually send something back to the user. And no matter what path they took, no matter what went wrong, I'm going to send something back to them. Okay. If there are no questions, let's get on to the next example. I do want to get a MySQL example in here. So MySQL is a bit different. The Docker file is going to be the same. We don't have to worry about that. This, as I say that, I show a complex Docker file. This is for Scala, and I started with straight up Ubuntu instead of finding either a Scala or a Java image. So I have to do a lot of installation just to get everything working. And this is actually the part that broke. Right here, Debian updated this repo. Like, this is the way that they say to install SBT, and they broke it. They updated something, broke it. All I get is errors when I run this, so I can't install SBT. Yay. Good job, guys. And since this downloads every time I build the container, there's not much I can do. Right here, this line breaks. There's not much I can do about that immediately without just reconfiguring anything. But the Docker Compose file is very different for MySQL. So with MySQL, you don't need Nginx. That's just, I happen to use it for this project. With MySQL, you do have to set up at least a password for the root user. So I have my root password. You have to specify the database name. And if you want, you can set up an additional user, MySQL user, MySQL password here. And then you need to communicate that username and password to your app container. So I'm using environment variables here. This MySQL image will read these exact environment variables if they exist, and then it'll do what it needs to do with them. If it sees MySQL underscore root underscore password, all uppercase, it's going to know that that's what you want as your root password. If you don't have this set, I don't even know what MySQL sets your password to. It might just not build. I don't know. You got to set at least the root password. Specify the database name when you connect to your MySQL server. It's going to be important to use this database name, or else it's going to say database doesn't exist. And then optionally, a MySQL user and password. And then in my app, I'm setting 2 additional user environment variables to tell my app what the username and password are. When I connect to the database, I'm going to make sure that I match everything that I named. So I named the host MySQL. I have to connect using MySQL. This is the protocol. Everything before that, : / that's the protocol, so that's not going to change. My host is going to be MySQL. I'm not going to specify a port because I'm using the default 3306. So no port needs to be specified. And then / database name. So whatever I named that database, and I could use another environment variable here if I wanted to, but that's not really secret information, so I didn't worry about it. But that's the URL to connect to the database. Then I'm going to read my environment variables for the username and password. I'm not putting passwords in my code. And then ideally, like when I run this in production, I would go through and actually change these passwords. I would change this to some just garbage. I don't want anybody accessing root. And then change this to something meaningful that matches this. Actually, that'd probably be garbage too, but I would just make sure that this matches. And then after that, it's SQL after that. One thing I forgot to show in the other example, just real quick, when I connected, I showed it, but I forgot to mention it. When I'm connecting to the database, if you're going through tutorials and you're running MongoDB locally, you're going to have localhost here. Make sure you don't use localhost. Localhost is going to break because you have to match the host that you gave it, the host name that you gave it right here. Whatever this is, that's what this has to be, the host that you're connecting to. I don't believe I have to specify the port here. I don't know why I specify the port there, since I'm using the default. But I just wanted to jump to that because I forgot to mention it earlier. Question?
Actually, two questions. For the first one, where you said put Mongo to work with your Docker file instead of localhost, when we're testing, if we're not using Docker, do we need to put localhost to test it?
Yeah. So when you're I'll stick with this example. So here I named it MySQL. If you're running MySQL locally and testing without Docker, which I do recommend because spinning up Docker every single time you want to test something, it takes a long time. So you would change this to localhost. If you're downloading, installing, and running MySQL or MongoDB locally, you would change this to localhost while you're testing locally. And please, please, please don't forget to change this to MySQL or whatever you named that app, whatever you named that service in your Docker file before you submit. Or else you're going to be sending me an email. Oh my goodness, I left it as localhost. Don't do that. Don't rely on my. I've been lenient with that, but don't rely on my leniency. I might run out of patience towards the end of the semester. Don't rely on my leniency for the grading. Make sure this is changed. Download your zip, like I said, run it, make sure everything works the way you expect it to. Don't be working last minute and then forget something like that, because technically that's all ones on your homework, assuming you attempted everything, ones and zeros, if you have that mistake, because none of the testing procedures work. So it's up to my leniency, do I not give you all ones? For homework 1, easy, simple enough mistake, we're just learning this new stuff. Homework 2, I have a lot of requests I have to think about how to handle. Homework 3 and 4, by that time you're still making mistakes like that. Come on, man. What are you doing at that point? Test your stuff. So you would change this to localhost if you're running locally, which I do recommend, but make sure you're testing with Docker Compose before you submit, and make sure that you don't make that mistake, and make sure it's changed before you submit. Because nothing works. If that's localhost, nothing works in Docker at all. And then we're going to say, you didn't even test in Docker. We're supposed to give you points. Homework 1, sure. Whatever. Homework 3?
Also, should we include that auto reconnect?
If you're having trouble, I had a specific bug where this was the answer. And specifically that was when my app was running for days. You're probably not going to run into that same thing.
Mm-hmm. So should we, when we're testing our homework, should we try to test it on multiple browsers? And, what would you recommend for range of browsers? Should we do Firefox and then Chrome? And that should cover most of it?
Firefox and Chrome does cover most things. Okay. But yeah, you should be testing in multiple browsers. You should be coding according to the protocol. If you implement the protocols the way they're meant to be implemented, then it's going to work on all browsers, barring some really strange things like Firefox's redirects with no content link. Barring things like that, you're going to work on all browsers. So testing on multiple browsers is going to let you know, if it works here but not over here, that tells you that you implemented something wrong, that you do have something to fix. If you want to test on one browser and just risk it and be like, well, it works on Chrome, I'm submitting, it might work on all browsers, but if it doesn't, if we test on Firefox, in 99% of all cases, it means that you implemented something wrong and that Chrome just happened to fix it for you. So yeah, you should definitely test on multiple browsers. And yeah, I'd say Chrome and Firefox handles it. But I haven't seen one case yet where it's like, it works here but not here, and I look at the student's code and they implemented everything right and the browser was wrong, aside from that one issue that I mentioned with Firefox. I'm pretty sure Firefox is in the wrong on that one. But it's more of an at your own risk kind of thing. If you only want to test in Chrome like a lot of students do, you better be confident in what you're doing. Oh, I'm trying to think of what I have to make sure I don't forget to say this. If you're testing with MySQL, I tell you this because I spent hours debugging it a few years ago, and you're changing these environment variables, if you're changing any of these, I don't know, just don't change them. If you're changing them, things are going to break. MySQL, the container, is only going to read these environment variables the very first time it's built. If you want to make any changes to these, you have to delete the image and then rebuild from scratch. Even when you tell it to rebuild, it will not look at these variables again. So any change you make here just doesn't reflect in the container, and your app is going to constantly say, invalid credentials can't connect to MySQL. It's frustrating. If you come across that, it's frustrating as hell. If I change this, maybe I want to change my password, and then I change it down here, well, guess what? My password has still changed me because MySQL didn't read that environment variable again. It's not reading those environment variables every time it starts up. It's only the first time the image is built. So either choose these once and then don't touch them, or make sure you're rebuilding your image, or use MongoDB. MongoDB, we didn't have to mess with any environment variables. Probably the easiest way to get through this course using MongoDB. Just because you don't have to mess with, like, there's some extra setup for MySQL. Yes?
So you mentioned before, obviously not wanting, the passwords and names for MySQL it. For this scenario, would we want to just have the Docker Compose in the Giving one?
You would want the Docker Compose in the repo. You wouldn't want everyone to write this when they go to deploy. But you do, this is my favorite solution, doing what I'm doing here. Just make sure the password is something that obviously needs to be changed. Change me is very effective in that. If the password's change me, that's your sign to anybody deploying to production that they need to change that password. So they would clone the whole repo with this Docker Compose file and then go into those environment variables and then change them. Or you can have these environment variables read local environment variables and then tell people, hey, you have to set these environment variables when you go to deploy. But you would definitely check this into the repo, because there's a lot of configuration here, especially when I slap Nginx on top of the whole thing. You don't want to, you have lengthy instructions of how to write the Docker Compose. I guess we'll jump to the other example quickly. It's very similar to the first one, it's just in Python. But since we're talking about Docker and Docker Compose, there's not a whole lot of difference. Actually, is there any difference? I guess just only when we get into the app.
Well, that was the Python buffer. I don't know what that was.
Where?
On the Docker Compose file.
Oh, I forgot to delete that. I don't remember what that, I think it was solving, I think I was debugging something. I think I was just playing around with something. And my local copy just ended up having that in there. I forget what this actually is. There was something I forget what I was playing with. You'll get that. You spend enough time in this field, you're going to forget more things than you ever know at any given time. I've forgotten so many things. There's just too much stuff to know. So where am I using Mongo? I want to show at least one. I use over here. So I connect to the database, again using Mongo, not localhost. I'm going to get the database. I'm going to get the collections that I'm interested in. And when I have the collections, I'm going to insert or find from these or remove. Insert one, find one, and use all of the MongoDB commands that we know, or that you'll find in documentation. I haven't, and again, I won't really cover the syntax for MongoDB much. I gave a few examples just to give you a taste of it, and then it's up to you to find that documentation as per, oops. As per the expectations. I only got 4 expectations, that's one of them. It's a big one. Develop software with little guidance. I guess these all, both of these are related to that. Anybody have anything else you'd like to see? Is this to the point where you can use this stuff? Yes.
I'm kind of curious,
Mm-hmm.
industry is putting passwords just in the environment. It says an environment variable standard practice. Are there any like safer way or different methods?
I think that's like the standard solution because the environment variables are specific to that machine, and nobody can read those environment variables unless they have access to that machine. So those environment variables aren't going into the repo, and they're not attached to the code in any way. Then in the code, you just read those environment variables. So then you have a different set of environment variables in dev and production.
So what if, like, when you're in production, let's say you spin up like a bunch of Docker containers on different like servers and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any way to like share those secrets between different containers?
I mean, you could do that with code. I guess you could have them send the secrets across. I would do that in the Docker Compose file. I would have Docker Compose, and I know I said this earlier. I had to look it up to make sure it's possible, but have Docker Compose read the environment variables on the system and then send them to all the other containers, and have Docker Compose be the communicator between them all. we're already at 1:10. I would try to look that up quick. I believe you can do that. I don't see why you wouldn't be able to. Is have Docker Compose read environment variables and then send them wherever you need them. That's the way I would do it. But you could, programmatically, you can write some code to send the values. But at the point that you're doing that, I'd say there's a better solution. I'd say that would be a solution you'd want to avoid. All right, yeah, we're out of time. So have a great day, everyone. See everyone Friday.